Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Letters from the Garden. The summer of 1914 draped itself over the Whitcroft estate like a dream, warm and heavy with the scent of 1,000 roses. It was a world of ordered beauty, of gravel paths and clipped hedges, but for Amelia Whitcroft, its perfection felt like a cage. Her father, a botanist of some renown, moved through this world with a collector's eye. He saw flora as a series of Latin classifications, for specimens to be dried, pressed, and catalogued in leather-bound books. To him, a rose was Rosa centifolia, its beauty a matter of petal count and stamen arrangement, its soul entirely absent from the equation. Amelia, however, found her solace in the garden's wilder arteries, where the formal beds gave way to rambling clematis and foxgloves that grew with a will of their own. It was there she first truly noticed Edward Hartley. He was the estate's gardener, a quiet man whose presence was as natural and unobtrusive as the ancient oaks that lined the drive. She had seen him 100 times, of course, but had never observed him. Not until that June afternoon. He was tending the roses, but it was not the methodical, almost surgical pruning her father employed. Edward's movements were a form of communion. His calloused hands, stained with the earth's own ink, moved with a reverence that spoke of a deep and patient understanding. He did not merely cut away the dead wood. He seemed to be listening to the plant, sensing its needs, encouraging its life. He was not a collector, he was a custodian. Her inner world, so often a landscape of unspoken thoughts, gave his presence a name. Father catalogues the world in Latin names and dried pressings, she thought, watching from the shade of a weeping willow. But Edward, he speaks to it in a language of touch and patience. He sees the life, not just the specimen. Their first proper conversation was orchestrated by the weather. A sudden summer shower descended, not with violence, but with a soft, insistent drumming that sent the birds to shelter and polished the leaves to a high green gloss. Amelia, caught near the glass houses, dashed for the nearest one, her light cotton dress instantly damp. She found him already there, standing amidst the humid air, thick with the smell of geraniums and wet soil. He was wiping his hands on a rag, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked panes. He turned at the sound of her entry, a flicker of surprise in his calm grey eyes. "Miss Whitcroft," he said, his voice as quiet as the garden after dusk. He offered a slight, respectful nod. "The rain caught me unawares," she said, a breathless quality to her voice she could not account for. To fill the sudden, charged silence, she gestured to the rows of terracotta pots. "Are these your experiments?" A faint smile touched his lips. It transformed his serious face, revealing a warmth she had not expected. "Experiments of a sort, miss. More like introductions, trying to convince a shy guest to make itself at home." He led her past benches of fuchsia and sleeping orchids to a corner where a single straggling rosebush stood in a large pot. It bore one perfect half-opened bloom. The colour was extraordinary, a deep dusky pink at the heart, fading to the palest blush at the edges of the petals, as if it held the twilight within it. "It's beautiful," Amelia whispered, drawn closer. "I've never seen one like it." "Nor have I. It's a chance seedling, a wild thing that grew where it shouldn't have." He reached out, his finger tracing the air just above a petal, not daring to touch it. "Some flowers, miss, you can't force. They have to decide to bloom on their own. This one, it's a stubborn one, but beautiful." In his private journal, filled with sketches of leaf patterns and notes on soil composition, he had already named it, the Amelia Rose, for it was, to him, the very essence of her, a rare and gentle beauty, flourishing quietly in a world that did not fully appreciate its worth. As she leaned in to breathe its faint, sweet scent, a single petal, loosened by the humidity, detached and drifted downwards. By a shared, unspoken instinct, both of their hands moved to catch it. Her soft, pale fingers brushed against his rough, earth-stained ones. It was a touch that lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but a current of unspoken electricity passed between them, potent and undeniable. He drew his hand back as if burned, the fallen petal resting in her palm like a secret. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, and the distant sound of church bells drifted across the fields, marking the slow, peaceful passage of an afternoon that had changed everything. The stolen touch in the glass house had unlatched a door between them, and in the weeks that followed they stepped through it. The late summer unfurled in a tapestry of clandestine meetings. Their encounters were woven into the fabric of the day, a shared glance across the lawn, a few words exchanged by the crumbling stone wall of the kitchen garden, and most treasured of all, long quiet hours in the waning afternoon light. Amelia would bring a book, often poetry, his verses a safe vessel for the emotions they dared not speak. She would read to him while he worked, her voice a soft melody against the rhythmic snip of his shears and the rustle of leaves. He, in turn, shared his world with her. Not the world of grand estates, but the smaller, more vital one at his feet. He taught her the language of the garden, how to read the curl of a leaf, how to know by the feel of the soil if it was thirsty, how to prune a branch not as an act of severance, but of promise. Their shared work became a silent courtship, their hands often brushing as they reached for the same tool or tended the same stem. He showed her his worn copy of Keats, the pages softened by countless readings, and pointed to a line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." "That's what this is," he had said, his gesture encompassing the entire garden. "Not because it's owned, because it lives." But as the golds and crimsons of early autumn began to bleed into the summer green, a shadow fell across their idyllic world. The war, once a distant rumble of headlines and solemn village prayers, was now a ravenous beast, devouring sons and brothers, and its hunger was growing. The news of conscription arrived not as a formal letter, but as a rumour that spread through the village like a fever, chilling the warmth of the harvest sun. One evening, as the last roses of the season clung stubbornly to their branches, Edward met Amelia by the old sundial. The air was cool, carrying the first premonition of winter. His usual quietude was heavy, freighted with a gravity that made her heart ache before he even spoke. "I've enlisted," he said. The words were simple, unadorned, and they fell between them like an axe, cleaving their fragile world in two. It was not a choice born of patriotic fire, but of a quiet, unshakable sense of duty he could not properly articulate. It was what a man did. It was what was expected. Amelia felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "But the garden," she managed, the words sounding feeble and childish even to her own ears. "Who will? You will," he said, his gaze meeting hers, full of a desperate, trusting faith. "You know its ways now." He saw the fear in her eyes, the protest forming on her lips, and in his mind a single agonizing thought circled. How do I leave this? This is my England. Not the one on the maps, with its cities and shires, but the one right here, in the scent of her hair and the warmth in her eyes. Their farewell was not a scene of grand cinematic passion. It was a moment of quiet desperation in the fading light, hidden from the great house by the high walls of the rose garden. Tears streamed down Amelia's face, silent and hot. "Promise you'll write?" she whispered, her voice thick with them. "Tell me everything, even if it's just about the colour of the sky, so I can see it with you." "I promise," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. He reached into his pocket and pressed something into her hand. It was a small bird carved from a piece of fallen oak, its form simple but so full of life it felt as though it might take flight from her palm. "I'll be back," he vowed, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, "when the real birds come home in the spring." He did not kiss her. The space between their social stations was a chasm too wide to cross, even in a moment of such profound connection. But the longing in his eyes was a brand on her heart. He held her gaze for a moment longer, memorizing her face in the twilight, then turned and walked away, leaving her clutching the solid, woody promise of his return as the first chill of autumn settled deep into her bones. The promise of a swift victory, of boys home by Christmas, dissolved into the grim, muddy reality of trench warfare. The years bled into one another, 1915, then 1916. Driven by a need to do something, anything more than wait, Amelia had volunteered as a nurse at the local Red Cross hospital, a converted manor house where the casualties of the war were brought to heal or to die. The sterile white corridors smelled of antiseptic and decay, a stark and brutal counterpoint to the vibrant life of her garden. The horrors she witnessed there, the quiet suffering of broken men, stripped away the last vestiges of her youthful innocence, replacing it with a stoic, aching empathy. Her only sanctuary was the garden. Tending it alone now, she felt Edward's presence in every task. His lessons guided her hands as she mounded earth around the base of the rose bushes to protect them from the frost, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The garden was no longer a pleasant escape. It was a living link to him, a sacred duty. Their correspondence became her lifeline. His letters, thin sheets of paper that felt impossibly fragile, arrived bearing the censor's stamp. He wrote from a world of mud and noise she could scarcely imagine. But as he had promised, he told her of the sky, of the surprising resilience of a single poppy growing on a trench wall, of the larks that still sang somehow above the din. And always, his letters ended with a question about their garden. "Have the climbing roses reached the top of the wall yet? Does the winter jasmine have many blooms? Tell me you can still smell the rosemary when you crush it between your fingers." She read his words as a coded language of love. When he asked of the garden, she knew he was asking if she remembered, if she was still his. "He never speaks of the fighting," she confessed to her diary, "only the mud and the birds and the roses, as if this garden is the only real thing left in the world." In her replies, she tucked fragments of that world, a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, a violet for faithfulness, a single perfect snowdrop to signify hope in the midst of winter. She imagined him opening her letters in the grim candlelight of a dugout, the scent of home a ghostly presence in the air thick with fear. Then, in the autumn of 1917, during the brutal, muddy slog of Passchendaele, the rhythm of their correspondence was broken. A letter arrived, but the handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was from another soldier, a corporal in Edward's company. The words were kind but blunt. Edward had been wounded during an advance. In the chaos and the shelling, he had been lost. Missing in action, presumed. The official letters from Edward stopped. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a vast, suffocating void that consumed the air in her lungs and the light from her days. She tried to fill it by throwing herself deeper into her work, her hands tending the wounds of other women's sons, her heart encased in ice. The garden became her only place of release, where her tears could fall and be mistaken for dew. She would walk the paths at dusk, whispering his name to the roses. "Silence was once a comfort between us," she wrote one night, her pen scratching frantically across the page. The easy quiet of two people who understood one another without words. Now it is a monster. It has devoured him whole. The crinkle of the dried flowers she kept from her unsent letters was the only sound in the aching emptiness of her room. The armistice came in November 1918. Church bells rang out across the country and people poured into the streets, their faces etched with a mixture of wild relief and hollow-eyed grief. But for Amelia, the joyous noise was a discordant clang against the profound silence that had settled in her soul. The war was over, but Edward was not home. The waiting had curdled into a state of suspended animation, and the garden, once her sanctuary, was becoming a beautiful, heartbreaking memorial. Her father, with a practicality she found both cruel and pitiable, saw her grief as an ailment to be cured. "The world is moving on, Amelia," he said one evening, his tone gentle but firm. "It is time you did too. Mr. Ainsworth has been most attentive. He comes from a good family." He looked out at the garden, its winter bones stark against the grey sky. "You cannot live in the past. This attachment, it is unhealthy." His words, meant to help, felt like a betrayal. That night, a storm broke, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that rattled the window panes and lashed the ancient trees. Drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, Amelia pulled a shawl over her shoulders and ran out into the tempest, not stopping until she reached the shelter of the glass house. The air inside was cold, the sound of the rain drumming on the glass roof a deafening roar. She sank to the floor, clutching the last mud-stained letter she had ever received from him, its paper softened and worn from 1,000 readings. Here, in the very place their connection had sparked into life, she was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of memory, grief, and a desperate, aching longing that was almost a physical pain. She closed her eyes, her forehead pressed against the cold, damp glass. The scent of the earth, rich and dark, and the rain-washed air filled her senses, and the storm outside seemed to merge with the one inside her heart. She was transported. The glass house was no longer cold and empty, but warm and humid, just as it had been on that first day. In the sanctuary of her mind, a vision took root, so vivid it felt more real than the grief that held her captive. She imagined his return. Not as a ghost, not as a broken soldier, but as the gardener she knew. He would come to her here in this very glass house, the scent of rain and roses clinging to his coat. He wouldn't need to speak. His eyes, those calm grey eyes, would say everything. In her dream of a moment that could never be, he would cross the flagstone floor and take her face in his hands. His touch would be the one she remembered, calloused but gentle, real and warm, and he would kiss her. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest, an ache that was no longer grief but a profound and painful longing. It was the kiss they never had, a release of all the unspoken words, the stolen glances, the shared silence. His hands, no longer rough from work but gentle with reverence, traced the curve of her back, drawing shivers that left her breathless. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. It was a consummation of the spirit, a powerful imagined intimacy that was both a first hello and a final heartbreaking goodbye. The vision crested and broke, the warmth receded, leaving only the cold glass against her skin. A great shuddering sob escaped her, then another, and another. She wept until she was empty, her tears mingling with the condensation on the panes. The storm of memory had passed, washing away not the love, not the pain, but the waiting. She was no longer waiting for Edward. She was finally, truly mourning him. The spring of 1919 arrived tentatively, as if unsure of its welcome in a world so weary of loss. But it came nonetheless, coaxing pale, fragile green from the dark, sleeping earth. In the Whitcroft garden, the first crocuses pushed through the soil, and the birds, as Edward had promised, returned. Their song was a balm to the quiet sorrow that had become Amelia's constant companion. In the wake of the storm in the glasshouse, a profound shift had occurred within her. She had made a choice. Her father saw the garden as a monument to a past she must escape. She would make it a living testament to healing. It would not be a static memorial to what was lost, but a dynamic, evolving space that held his memory while growing into something new, something uniquely her own. She began to work with a renewed purpose, her grief now channeled into creation. She pored over her father's botany books, but this time with a new eye, seeing not just classifications but possibilities. She started to experiment, grafting a hardy local rootstock onto a more delicate French rose, sketching out plans for a bed that would blend the wild and the cultivated, a reflection of the two worlds she and Edward had shared. One bright April morning, as she was carefully turning the soil near the main lawn, a man appeared at the edge of the garden. He was tall, with a kind face and the unmistakable bearing of a former officer, his arm held stiffly at his side. He introduced himself as Captain Davies. He had served with Edward. "I've been trying to find you for months," he said, his voice gentle. "I was with him, at the end." He had come to deliver Edward's personal effects, a small water-damaged satchel containing his journal, and tucked carefully inside a pocket the small carved wooden bird piece. He told her how Edward had been wounded while pulling another man, the corporal who had written to her, to safety during a bombardment. "He was the best of us," the captain said simply. "He spoke of you and of this garden. He said it was the most peaceful place on earth." Later, sitting in the quiet of her room, Amelia opened the journal. Its pages were stiff and warped, but his handwriting was still clear. It was filled with his observations of plants, sketches of birds, and thoughts on the sky. And tucked between the pages, like treasured secrets, were the flowers she had sent him. A flattened violet, a brittle sprig of rosemary, their colours faded, but their meaning as potent as ever. On the very last page, dated 2 days before he was killed, was a detailed, loving sketch of the unnamed rose from the glasshouse. Beneath it, he had written a final note, his words a release and a blessing. "If love is a seed, let it grow where it may, even if I am not there to see it bloom." The next day Amelia walked out into the garden, the journal entry a quiet song in her heart. She carried a small potted rosebush, a cutting she had taken from the original and nurtured through the winter. It was the stubborn, beautiful rose, the Amelia rose. She had chosen its spot with care, in the most prominent part of the garden, where the sun would touch it first in the morning and last in the evening. This final intimate act was not one of sorrow, but of profound purpose. She knelt, digging her hands deep into the rich, dark soil. It was cool and damp, teeming with the promise of life. This was not the act of tending a memory, but of planting a future. The intimacy was with the earth itself, with the relentless, beautiful cycle of loss and renewal. Her hands, no longer soft and pale, but capable and stained with soil, firmed the earth around the fragile roots. This was her identity, she realized. Not a botanist's daughter, not a soldier's ghost, but a creator, a gardener. The passion that had once been a secret, desperate longing, was now a quiet, steady strength, a deliberate, loving act of creation. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees, and looked at the small, valiant plant. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sound of birdsong. She placed her hand over her heart, feeling its steady, quiet beat, and she knew, with a certainty that settled in her very bones, that this was not an ending, it was a planting. Portraits in gold. The light in the Jardin du Luxembourg in late October was a painter's dream, a soft, honeyed gold that dripped through the skeletal fingers of the horse-chestnut trees. It cast long, romantic shadows on the gravel paths, turning the ordinary into the archetypal. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sweet decay of leaves, a smell that was both a memory and a premonition. It was the last warm day before the inevitable chill of winter, a day that felt like a secret whispered between seasons. Harmony Collins sat on a wooden bench before a marble statue of a grieving nymph, a sketchbook open on her lap. Her world had shrunk to the size of the textured paper, to the small universe she was creating with the gritty scratch of charcoal. She was an American art student, young and adrift in the grand, beautiful and utterly indifferent city of Paris. Art was her only true confidant, the silent, patient recipient of her loneliness. The nymph, with her bowed head and the elegant sorrow carved into her features, felt like a sister. Harmony was trying to capture not just the lines of the statue, but the weight of its grief, the cold finality of the stone. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the man who sat on a nearby bench, a book lying unread in his lap. He was watching her, not with the intrusive gaze she'd grown accustomed to in the city, but with a quiet, weary appreciation. His name was Martel Fournier, and he was a man in his late 40s, with a face that held the noble, severe lines of a Roman bust. His greying hair was impeccably styled, and his clothes were of a quality that spoke of old money and quiet confidence. But it was his eyes that held one's attention. They were the colour of a stormy sea, and they held a profound, ancient sorrow, a mirror to the grief of the nymph Harmony was so diligently sketching. Harmony's charcoal pencil, worn to a nub, slipped from her fingers. It rolled off the edge of her sketchbook and across the gravel, coming to a stop just beside one of Martel's impeccably polished leather shoes. The small sound broke the spell of her concentration. She looked up, flustered, her cheeks flushing with a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. He retrieved the pencil, his movement graceful and deliberate, as if he were handling a precious artifact. He rose and walked towards her, the fallen leaves crunching softly under his feet. When he held the pencil out to her, their fingers brushed. It was a small, startling spark of warmth against the cool autumn air, a brief connection that sent a shiver through her. The contrast between the cold, enduring marble of the statue and the brief, living warmth of their hands touching was not lost on her. "You see the sorrow in the stone," he said. His voice was low and resonant, like an echo in a cathedral, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. Most people only notice the form. Harmony looked from the man to the statue and back again. His eyes, they held the very same sorrow as the statue, as if he were carved from the same ancient loss. The thought was so clear, so certain that it felt like a revelation. She took the pencil, her fingers trembling slightly. I think the artist had to feel it to make others see it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Yes," he said. He did. He did not leave. He stood there for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on her drawing. "You have a gift," he said, and it was not a compliment, but a statement of fact. Then, with another small, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the golden light of the Parisian afternoon, leaving Harmony with the lingering warmth of his touch and the echo of his voice. She watched him go, a strange sense of loss settling in her chest. For the rest of the day she could not bring herself to draw. The grieving nymph seemed to mock her with its perfect unchanging sorrow. Harmony had just encountered a grief that was alive, and it had left her breathless. The crisp autumn air carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and the distant accordion music from the Pont Neuf was a tonic for the soul. Several days after her encounter in the Jardin du Luxembourg, Harmony found herself completely absorbed in the treasures of the bouquinistes along the Seine. She was tracing the delicate lines of an 18th century botanical print with her finger, lost to the world, when a low voice spoke beside her. "The line work is exquisite, is it not? So confident, yet so fragile. The voice was low and resonant, and instantly familiar. Harmony's head snapped up, her heart giving a sudden sharp leap. It was the man from the park. He was standing beside her, a slim volume of poetry in his hand, a small, gentle smile on his face that seemed to acknowledge the serendipity of the moment. "We met in the Jardin de Luxembourg," he said, saving her the trouble of placing him. "You were drawing the nymph." "Yes," she breathed, a blush warming her cheeks. "I remember." "I'm Martel Fournier," he said, extending a hand. "Harmony Collins," she replied, placing her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm. "Harmony," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It sounded like a piece of music. "It suits you. I was just on my way for a chocolate show to escape this autumn wind. Would you allow me to treat you, Miss Collins? As a small thank you for reminding me how to truly look at a piece of art." He led her to a small book-lined cafe, its windows steamy with warmth. The chocolat chaud was rich and dark, the pastry flaky and buttery. Now that the slight awkwardness of their reacquaintance had passed, the conversation flowed as effortlessly as the Seine outside the cafe window. They talked about art and history, about the way the past was always present in Paris, in the worn cobblestones and the ancient churches. They discovered a shared feeling of being slightly out of step with the frantic pace of the modern world. He spoke of ancient things as if they were still breathing, and she in turn showed him the raw, vibrant emotion in a single brushstroke of an impressionist painting. "It is my profession, I suppose," he admitted with a wry smile when she pointed this out. "I am an antiquarian. I keep a small gallery on the Quai Voltaire." His eyes lit up with a passion that momentarily eclipsed their sadness. "It is filled with objects that have survived empires, voices from the past. Perhaps you would allow me to show you. It is not far from here." The invitation felt less like a proposition and more like an offering, a sharing of his most intimate world. Harmony accepted without hesitation. A short walk through the winding streets, with the crisp air invigorating them, brought them to a discreet storefront with the name Fournier Essier in elegant gold script. Inside was a hidden gem, a quiet space filled with ancient treasures. It was here that he showed her a 2,000-year-old Roman glass vial, its surface iridescent with age. He handled it with a surgeon's care, his long, elegant fingers tracing its delicate form. "This glass, it survived the fall of an empire," he said, his voice low and intimate in the quiet gallery. "It makes one's own sorrows feel correctly scaled, and yet terribly immense all the same." Harmony listened, mesmerized. He speaks of ancient things as if they're still breathing, but when he looks at me, it's as if he's seeing something new, something he's almost afraid to touch. What does he see in me? In the profound silence that followed his words, a new level of intimacy was forged between them. It was as if by sharing the weight of history, he had made it possible to share something of themselves. That afternoon was the first of many. Their meetings became a regular occurrence. They walked through the hallowed halls of the Musée d'Orsay, their shoulders occasionally brushing, sending a jolt of awareness through her. They wandered along the banks of the Seine as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, the lights of the Bateau Mouche drifting by like floating lanterns. The melancholic tone of their first encounter slowly transformed into a growing warmth, a fragile, precious trust being built between them. During one of their walks, he spoke of loss in the abstract. He never mentioned his late wife by name, but the weight of her memory was a palpable presence between them, a shadow that lengthened as the sun set. He confessed that observing Harmony's passion for creation, her fierce, youthful engagement with the world, was the first true light he had allowed himself to feel in years. "You are like a splash of vibrant colour in a world that has gone monochrome," he told her, his gaze intense. That evening, As they stood on the Pont des Arts, the city lights shimmering like fallen stars on the dark moving water of the Seine, he took her hand. His touch was no longer a brief accidental spark, but a deliberate possessive gesture. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. "Harmony," he said, her name a soft murmur on his lips. "I..." He stopped, his throat working. He did not need to finish the sentence. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the longing and the fear, and in that moment she knew she was falling in love with this sad, beautiful man who lived in the past. She also knew, with a chilling certainty, that his past was a fortress she might never be able to breach. Martel's apartment on the Ile Saint-Louis was less a home than a private museum. It was breathtakingly beautiful, with high ceilings, ornate mouldings, and large windows that overlooked the Seine. Every object was impeccably curated, from the ancient Greek amphorae to the Renaissance tapestries. But for all its beauty, the apartment was utterly airless, a shrine to a perfectly preserved past. The tone of their nascent relationship, once so full of warmth and intellectual intimacy, became strained, heavy with unspoken anxieties. He invited her to a small formal gathering for his clients, a collection of wealthy, sophisticated collectors who moved through the apartment with an air of casual ownership. Harmony, in her simple black dress, felt like an exhibit herself, her youthful uncertainty a stark contrast to their polished elegance. The clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of polite conversation felt sharp and brittle to her ears. A well-meaning friend of Martel's, a portly man with a booming voice, approached them. "Martel, my friend," he exclaimed, clapping him on the back. "How wonderful to see you with such fresh vitality. Hélène would be so happy you're no longer alone." The casual mention of his late wife's name was a physical blow to Harmony. The air left her lungs. She looked across the room and saw what she had somehow missed before, a large gilded portrait of a woman hanging above the marble fireplace. The woman was stunning, with dark, intelligent eyes and a confident, worldly smile. She was everything Harmony was not. She was the finished masterpiece in a gilded frame. Harmony felt like a preliminary sketch, a study he would eventually discard. After the guest departed, the silence in the apartment was cavernous. Martel, sensing her withdrawal, became formal and guarded, the warmth in his eyes replaced by a familiar, weary sorrow. He was terrified he had unfairly pulled this vibrant young woman into the shadows of his grief. She, in turn, misinterpreting his distance as regret, felt a cold certainty crystallize in her heart. "Thank you for everything, Martel," he said, her voice polite, distant. It was a beautiful education. The words hung in the air between them, devastatingly final. He did not try to stop her as she walked to the door. He simply stood there, a solitary figure in his beautiful, silent mausoleum. "I have done it," he thought, the silence of the room pressing in on him. "I have brought this living, breathing girl into a mausoleum. It is a cruelty I cannot permit myself." Harmony walked home through the cold night, the chill in the air a welcome distraction from the ice in her heart. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The perfect, smiling, permanent portrait of his late wife was burned into her memory, a constant reminder of the ghost she could never compete with. The rift between them felt as wide and as deep as the dark, cold Seine. For a week, there was only silence, a heavy, agonizing silence that was more painful than any argument. Harmony threw herself into her work, her small, cluttered studio apartment in Montmartre becoming her sanctuary and her prison. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil was a constant, acrid reminder of her solitude. It was raining, a relentless, mournful drum against the attic window, the sound a perfect accompaniment to the storm in her heart. Then one evening there was a knock on her door, a frantic, desperate sound that was completely out of character for the composed, elegant man she knew. She opened it to find Martel standing there, soaked by the storm, his legendary composure shattered. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his expensive coat was dripping onto the worn wooden floor. His gaze fell upon an unfinished canvas on her easel. It was a portrait of him, but not the polished antiquarian she had met at the gallery. It was the sad, solitary man from the park bench, his eyes filled with a universe of unspoken grief. She had rendered him with a startling and intimate empathy, capturing the vulnerability he kept so carefully hidden from the world. Seeing it, he finally broke. The carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled. "I am a fool," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "A coward." He stepped into the small room, the space suddenly charged with an electric tension. "I have spent 3 years living in a tomb of my own making," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so afraid of forgetting her, of betraying her memory, but I was more afraid of never feeling again. And then you came into my life like a sunrise, and I was terrified. Terrified of the joy you bring me, of the light you shine on all my carefully preserved shadows. I love you, Harmony. I love you with a desperation that terrifies me, a love I believe I have no right to." The raw confession melted the last of her restraint. He stepped forward, and the kiss was one of both absolution and starvation. It tasted of rain and salt and a week of indolence. He kissed her, like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest. He murmured her name against her lips, a prayer and a surrender. His heavy rain-damp coat fell to the floor, a sodden heap of his former self. His hands, which had held ancient fragile things with such reverence, now traced her back with a tremor of that same reverence, drawing shivers that left her breathless. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. There was no hurry. He undressed her slowly, as if unwrapping a priceless living treasure he was seeing for the first time. The cool air of the rain-swept room kissed her skin, a stark contrast to the heat of his touch. She in turn unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers tracing the lines of a body that had known a different life, a different love, but was here, with her, now. Her gasp turned into a moan as his hand slid lower, exploring her with a reverence that was both sacred and profane. Clothes fell away, skin meeting skin in a heated rush that stole their breath. He moved within her slowly at first, savouring the way her body arched and trembled beneath his touch, then faster as their shared need consumed them in waves of pleasure. The lovemaking that followed was a quiet, sacred conversation in the heart of the storm, a promise spoken not in words but in touch and sigh, a healing act where every glance, every slow movement, affirmed that the past could be honoured without eclipsing the present. In the heart of the storm, they found a stillness, a sanctuary, a new beginning. They fell asleep in the small bed, tangled in each other's arms while the rain softened to a gentle patter. When Harmony awoke, the storm had passed. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the attic window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Martel was still asleep, his face in repose looking younger, the deep lines of sorrow smoothed away. She lay there, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, a profound sense of peace settling over her. This was not an ending, but a quiet, sun-drenched beginning. Months later, deep winter had settled over Paris. The grand, formal rooms of Martel's apartment on the Ile Saint-Louis were transformed. The oppressive velvet silence was gone, replaced by a palpable warmth and the quiet, comfortable sounds of a shared life. Bright, clear sunlight streamed through the large windows, no longer seeming to merely illuminate a museum, but to fill a home. Harmony's easel now stood in the place of honour by the window, catching the best of the northern light. A large, vibrant canvas, a chaotic and joyful explosion of colour and emotion, was a living counterpoint to his ordered ancient world. Her work in progress was not an intrusion, but a vital centre of the room. He had made space for her, literally and figuratively, and in doing so had let the air and light back into his own life. One afternoon she was dabbing at her canvas, her brow furrowed in concentration, when he came to stand behind her. He didn't speak, simply rested his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back against him, the familiar gesture a comfort. "The ochre is fighting the blue," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Let it fight," he said softly in her ear. "There is beauty in the tension." She smiled. He was learning. Later that day he came home with a gift. It was not an artifact salvaged from the dust of history. It was a beautiful antique wooden box, and inside, nestled in deep blue velvet, were rare hand-milled pigments in shades of lapis, cinnabar and vermilion, colours of life, of passion, of royalty. "For your art," he said, his voice soft, "for all the beautiful things you have yet to create." She looked from the brilliant jewel-like powders to his face, her eyes filling with tears. It was a gift for her future, a profound vote of confidence in her talent, a promise that he saw her not as a fleeting distraction, but as an artist in her own right. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Martel." "I love you," he replied, his voice filled with a certainty that had once been so absent. "You have taught me that a heart can expand, that it can hold both cherished memory and new, breathtaking joy." The story of their love concluded not with a grand gesture, but with the simple, profound beauty of them existing together. A quiet Sunday morning found them tangled in white sheets, the crisp winter sun warming their skin. This was not the desperate passion of the storm, but the slow, languid intimacy of an established love. He traced the curve of her spine with one finger, his touch a familiar, comforting map of her body. She turned in his arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "Do you remember that first day in the park?" she asked softly. "You looked so sad, like that statue." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I was a statue, and you, my love, brought me to life." He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her lips, slow, soft, possessive kisses that held no fear, only a deep, abiding certainty. They spoke in low murmurs, planning a small trip to the coast, talking about her first gallery show, which he was organising with the fierce pride of a patron and a lover. His belief in her had become her own, and she spoke of her work with a new, quiet confidence. It was an intimacy of profound comfort and safety, a testament to the beautiful, durable life they were building together, piece by piece. He had spent a lifetime collecting relics of the past, believing their permanence was a shield against loss, only to discover that true immortality was not in gold or stone, but in the fleeting, breathtaking warmth of a hand that chose to reach for his in the present. And as he held her in his arms, the winter sun streaming in, he knew, with a joy that was both profound and peaceful, that he was finally home. The last carriage to Raven Hall. The Brambleworth Railway Station Café was an island of bustling, temporary warmth against the encroaching December chill of 1908. The air, thick with the ceaseless murmur of conversation and the steam from an endless service of tea, fogged the grand windows, blurring the edges of the world outside into a swirl of white. Snow, which had begun as a gentle, festive dusting, now fell with a quiet insistence, tapping against the frosted glass like restless fingers. For everyone else, this place was a brief pause on a journey home. For Evangeline Hartwell, it was the end of the line. She sat alone at a small wobbly table, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. The telegram, its stark black letters a brutal slash against the creamy paper, lay crumpled by her saucer. Mrs. Abernathy passed peacefully in her sleep. Services no longer required. Just like that, the last 4 years of her life, of being useful, of having a place, had been neatly folded and tucked away. She was no longer a governess, simply a woman suspended between worlds, with a ticket back to a sister's charity she could not yet bear to use. The cafe door opened with a gust of frigid air and a jingle of bells, and he entered. Lord Adrian Blackwood shook the snow from the shoulders of his greatcoat, his movements economical and precise, yet tinged with a weariness that seemed to settle deeper than the cold. His hair was the colour of wet slate, his jaw firm, but it was his eyes that held her. Across the crowded room they found hers, dark, guarded, and holding a sorrow so profound it felt like a shared secret. Evangeline looked away, a flush rising on her cheeks. It was improper to stare, a lesson drilled into her since childhood. A governess was meant to be invisible, a placid and unassuming fixture in the background of other people's lives. But in that fleeting moment she had not felt invisible. She had felt seen. Adrian's gaze lingered. He saw not just a pretty, solemn woman in a simple woolen dress, but the way she held herself, a stillness that was less about composure and more about a quiet bracing against an unseen blow. He saw the tremor in her hand as it hovered over the teacup, the unshed tears that gave her grey eyes the luminous quality of a winter sky just before dawn. He recognised the look of someone unmoored, adrift on a sea of polite, festive chaos. He crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by the din, and stopped at her table. "Pardon the intrusion," he said, his voice a low baritone, smoother than she'd expected. "But you have the look of someone whose destination has just changed without warning." Evangeline's head snapped up, her heart giving a startled little flutter. Up close, his eyes were even more striking, flecked with hints of amber like last autumn leaves trapped in ice. She should have offered a polite dismissal, a murmur of denial. Instead, the truth slipped out, raw and unguarded. "And you," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper, "have the look of someone who understands that feeling." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting, melancholy thing. "I do," he admitted. He gestured to the empty chair opposite her. "May I?" She nodded, a small, jerky motion. He sat, placing his leather gloves on the table. The rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the station clock seemed to grow louder, measuring out the seconds of this strange shared silence. Outside, the snow was now a thick, swirling curtain, erasing the world. "This storm is getting worse," he observed, his gaze drifting to the window. "The station master just announced the last train to London has been cancelled. Nothing is moving until it passes." A fresh wave of panic washed over Evangeline. Stranded, utterly and completely stranded. Her meagre savings would not stretch to a hotel room for an indeterminate number of days. The carefully constructed wall of her composure began to crumble. Adrian saw the shift in her expression, the flicker of fear that replaced the sorrow. It was an impulsive thought, one born of a loneliness that mirrored her own, a reckless disregard for the rigid rules that governed his life. "My carriage is waiting," he said, the word surprising even himself. "I'm headed to my estate, Ravenhall. It's only a few miles from here. The roads will be difficult, but passable for now." He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. "There is more than enough room. You could wait out the storm there. It would be no trouble at all." The offer hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. A lord and a governess. It was scandalous. It was unthinkable. Her sister's voice, sharp and disapproving, echoed in her mind. "Know your place, Evangeline." But her place was gone. Her destination had vanished. All she had was this moment, this station clock ticking toward an unknown future, and the gaze of a man who looked at her not as a servant, but as a fellow traveller whose journey had been unexpectedly rerouted. She began, her throat tight. "Please," he said, and the single word was not a command but a plea. "I confess the prospect of being snowed in alone at Ravenhall is a bleak one. I would be grateful for the company." In his eyes she saw it again, that flicker of shared recognition. He was not just offering her shelter, he was admitting his own need for it. And in that moment of raw honesty, the societal rules that had defined her entire life seemed to melt away like the frost on the window pane. She gave a small, decisive nod. "Thank you, Lord Blackwood," she said, her voice finding its strength. "I accept." The carriage was a world unto itself, a dark, cocoon-like space smelling of old leather, damp wool, and the faint, clean scent of snow. Inside, the roar of the wind and the clamour of the station were replaced by a profound, muffled quiet. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of the suspension, the soft jingle of the harness, and the steady, muffled thump, thump, thump of the horses' hooves on the snow-covered road. It was a sound like a slow, steady heartbeat, measuring the passage of time in this strange liminal space. They sat opposite each other, their knees occasionally brushing when the carriage swayed. The landscape outside was a ghostly watercolour of white and grey, the trees skeletal figures draped in ermine, the fields vast, empty canvases. The journey became a metaphor for their situation, suspended between a past that had just ended and a future that was entirely unknown. For the first mile the silence was thick with unspoken questions. Evangeline held her hands tightly in her lap, her mind racing. She had just entrusted herself to a complete stranger, a nobleman whose life was as far removed from hers as the moon from the earth. And yet she did not feel afraid. She felt a quiet, thrumming curiosity. It was Adrian who spoke first, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the small space. "Ravenhall was my father's pride," he said, his gaze fixed on the shifting snow outside the window. "He collected it, the way some men collect art or horses. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every ridiculously ornate teacup was chosen to project an image of power and permanence." He let out a soft, humourless laugh. He never seemed to notice that his wife was fading away within its perfectly decorated walls. The confession was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that it took Evangeline's breath away. This was not the idle chatter of a lord making conversation with a temporary guest. This was a glimpse into the guarded fortress of his heart. "You speak of it as if it isn't your home," she ventured softly. His gaze shifted from the window to her face, and the vulnerability in his eyes was startling. "It isn't," he said simply. "It's my inheritance, my duty, a beautiful prison I never asked for. I was the second son, you see. My brother was meant to be the lord. I was meant for a quiet life, a scholarly one. But then, fate had other plans." He didn't need to elaborate. The weight of his unwanted title settled between them. His honesty unlocked her own. "I understand," she found herself saying, the words tasting of a truth she rarely spoke aloud. "Being what others need you to be. My sister believes my only value lies in my utility. To be a governess, then a wife, then a mother, a series of roles to be played. I've spent so long being what others needed me to be, I've forgotten what I might want for myself." She looked down at her gloved hands. "I fear becoming a permanent burden, always living on the edge of someone else's life, dependent on their charity." "Then perhaps this storm is a gift," he murmured, his voice gentle. "Time to remember." Their bodies swayed together as the carriage hit a rut, and for a moment his hand instinctively reached out to steady her, his fingers brushing her arm. The touch was brief, a fleeting spark of warmth through the thick wool of her coat, but it sent a jolt through her that was anything but fleeting. It was electric, significant. She looked up at him, and the air in the carriage grew thick, charged with a new awareness. The space between them no longer felt like a formal distance, but a taut magnetic field. She saw the way the dim light caught the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. He saw the soft curve of her lips, the intelligence and sorrow that warred in her lovely luminous eyes. It was more than just shared loneliness now. It was a spark, a flicker of mutual attraction, of recognizing a kindred soul not just in circumstance, but in spirit. Two people, displaced by duty and loss, finding an unexpected and dangerous understanding in the heart of a winter storm. The horses slowed, and Adrian leaned forward to peer through the window. "We're here," he announced, his voice a little thicker than before. Through the swirling snow, Evangeline saw it. Raven Hall. It rose from the white landscape, not like a house, but like a piece of the winter itself. All dark stone, sharp gables and towering chimneys that seemed to scratch at the bruised purple sky. It was magnificent, imposing, and profoundly lonely. It was a perfect reflection of the man who sat before her. And for the first time in a very long time, Evangeline Hartwell felt a tremor not of fear, but of anticipation. The storm did not abate. For 3 days, Raven Hall was an island in a silent white ocean. The snow fell relentlessly, burying the world and trapping them within the manor's stone walls. The servants, all of whom lived in the nearby village, were unable to make the journey, leaving the vast, echoing house to its reluctant lord and his unexpected guest. The grand silence of the estate, which Adrian had always found oppressive, was now filled with the small, intimate sounds of two people simply existing together. Their days fell into a strange and comfortable rhythm. In the mornings, Adrian would build a roaring fire in the library's cavernous hearth, while Evangeline, surprisingly resourceful, navigated the cavernous kitchens to produce toast and coffee. They would eat at a small table, the great dining hall with its ghostly sheet-draped chairs ignored. These ordinary acts, performed in the extraordinary context of their shared solitude, became charged with a quiet intimacy. The library became their sanctuary. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with towering shelves of books that smelled of leather and time. Here, the weight of their disparate social stations seemed to dissolve among the words of poets and philosophers. Adrian, who had confessed his preference for tending gardens over managing ledgers, seemed most himself in this room. He showed her his father's collection of botanical illustrations, his fingers gently tracing the delicate hand-painted petals of a long-extinct rose. He appreciated their beauty, Adrian said, his voice soft, but I don't think he ever understood their resilience, what it takes for something to grow in difficult soil. "I think I do," Evangeline replied, her gaze meeting his over the fragile painted leaves. In the evenings, by the flickering light of the fire and a single oil lamp, they would read aloud. Adrian's voice, a deep and resonant baritone, gave new life to the prose of Dickens and Hardy. But it was when he asked her about her own passions that the last of her defences truly began to crumble. "You spoke of wanting things for yourself," he said one evening, closing the book he'd been reading. The firelight danced across his face, softening its aristocratic lines. "What are they?" Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of the small leather-bound journal tucked away in her valise, filled with the cramped secret scrawl of her poetry. It was the only part of her that was truly her own, unshaped by the expectations of others. "It's nothing, really," she demurred, her cheeks growing warm. "Just foolish scribbles." "I doubt that," he said, his gaze gentle but persistent. "Nothing about you is foolish." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding hers. "Read me something you've written." "I couldn't," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "They're too honest." "Then they're exactly what I need to hear," he insisted softly. His sincerity was a key, turning the lock on a door she had kept bolted for years. Hesitantly, she retrieved her journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it to a page filled with a poem about a ship lost at sea, searching not for a harbour, but for a piece of the sky to call its own. She began to read, her voice a low, tremulous whisper at first, then growing stronger as the words took hold. When she finished, a profound silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle and hiss of the fire. She dared not look at him, her face burning with a mixture of terror and relief. "Evangeline," Adrian said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached across the space between them, his fingers gently touching her chin, tilting her face up to his. That was beautiful, and not honest at all. It was the truest thing I've ever heard. His face was inches from hers. The air grew heavy, electric with a longing that had been building for days. She could see the firelight reflected in the dark pools of his eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything. Her lips parted slightly in anticipation. He leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her mouth, and the world seemed to narrow to this single, perfect, terrifying moment. Then, a log in the hearth shifted and collapsed with a loud crack and a shower of sparks breaking the spell. Adrian blinked, pulling back as if startled, the charged current between them suddenly broken. A shadow of his old guarded self flickered across his face. "The fire," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse and practical. "We should bank it for the night. It will be a cold one." The moment was gone, but the memory of it remained, a burning ember in the quiet, snowbound heart of Raven Hall. The thaw came as abruptly as the storm. On the fourth morning, Evangeline awoke to a world transformed. Sunlight, pale but brilliant, streamed through the mullioned windows of her guest room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The oppressive silence of the snow had been replaced by a gentle, rhythmic dripping as icicles melted from the eaves. The world was stirring, reawakening, and with it, reality came rushing back in. A groom, dispatched by Adrian the day before with a message to inform Evangeline's sister of her safety and whereabouts, had finally managed to return through the thawing snow. He carried a small sack of general post, but he delivered a specific sealed letter to Evangeline first, a letter he had collected directly from her sister's hand. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and impatient. With trembling fingers, Evangeline broke the seal. A moment later, a sharp knock came at her door. It was Adrian. He held a telegram in his hand, his face a mask of grim resignation. "My mother," he said, his voice flat. "She expects me in London. The social season is beginning. She has, in her words, arranged several promising introductions. A strategic marriage is expected." They stood in the hallway, the brilliant morning light a cruel mockery of the sudden darkness that had fallen between them. The fragile, magical world they had built within the snowbound walls of Raven Hall was dissolving like the frost on the window panes. The outside world, with its rigid rules and suffocating expectations, was demanding their return. "So, you will go," Evangeline stated, the words tasting like ash. It wasn't a question. "It is my duty," he replied, the words stiff, formal. "And I have mine," she said, holding up her sister's letter like a shield. "A position in Yorkshire awaits." The space between them crackled with unspoken words, with the ghost of the kiss that had never happened. Evangeline turned to go back to her room, to pack her meagre belongings, to fold herself back into the small, neat box of her former life. She could not bear to look at him, to see the reluctant lord who would do his duty, just as she would do hers. "Don't!" Adrian's voice, raw and urgent, stopped her. "Don't go!" She turned back slowly, her heart a painful drum against her ribs. "What would you have me do, my lord?" she asked, a bitter edge to her voice she could not contain. "Stay here? In what capacity? Your charity case? Your secret shame to be hidden away when your promising introductions come to call?" The word struck him like a physical blow. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. The cold mask of the aristocrat was gone, replaced by a desperate, aching vulnerability. "As my equal," he said, his voice thick and hoarse. "As my choice." He let out a ragged breath. "Evangeline, I am afraid. My father's neglect was a kind of violence. It hollowed out my mother until she was nothing but a beautiful, brittle shell. I am afraid of that power, of caring for someone only to destroy them. And I'm afraid of being a burden," she cried, the tears she had held back for so long finally spilling over. "Of being a thing that is cared for, but never truly wanted for who she is." "I want you," he breathed, his forehead pressing against hers. The words were a warm puff of air against her skin, a vibration that travelled straight to her soul. She could smell the cold morning on his coat, the scent of old books from the library and something else beneath it all, a scent of earth and will that was purely, intoxicatingly his. "I want your honesty, your resilience, your foolish, beautiful poetry. I want all of it." His mouth found hers then, not as a deluge, but as a discovery. It was a kiss of profound recognition, a tasting of the truth that had lived between them since that first glance across the station cafe. His lips were firm and searching, and she answered with a lifetime of unspoken need, her own mouth softening, opening for him. It was a silent, desperate conversation. Her hands, no longer hesitant, wove into the thick hair at the nape of his neck, her fingers pressing into him, claiming him as he was claiming her. He groaned, a low sound from deep in his chest, and his arms banded around her, lifting her until there was no space left between them, just the frantic beating of 2 hearts. He carried her back into her room and kicked the door shut, the sound a final, definitive closing off of the outside world. There were no others here, no sisters, no mothers, no duties, only them. He set her down gently, his hands framing her face. His fingers trembled as they went to the tiny buttons of her bodice, his eyes never leaving hers, asking a question his lips did not form. Her own hands, clumsy with need, went to his shirt, her palms greedy for the warmth of his skin. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with the heat of their shared urgency. He paused, his hands stilling over her heart. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice breaking on the words. She looked up into his dark, earnest eyes and felt a profound shift inside her. This was not a surrender. It was a choice. Her choice. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady and clear with a power she had never known she possessed. She reached up, her hand tracing the line of his jaw. "Adrian, I am sure." A look of profound relief and a love so tender it stole her breath washed over his face. He leaned in and kissed her again, not with the desperate hunger of before, but with a slowness that felt like a sacred vow. It was a kiss that erased all the silence and distance of the past months, a gentle pressure that spoke of promises kept and futures yet unwritten. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones as if she were the most fragile, precious thing in the world. He drew her closer until her forehead rested against his, and they simply breathed together, sharing the same air. The morning sun streamed through the window, bathing them in a warm golden light that felt like a benediction. She felt the steady, reassuring beat of his heart through his shirt, a rhythm that grounded her, telling her this was real. This was not a dream born of a snowstorm. This quiet room, this man, this feeling of rightness. It was solid. It was truth. Pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, he didn't need to speak. She saw it all there, the last of his fear melting away, replaced by a certainty that mirrored her own. The world outside, with its telegrams and duties, was a faint, distant echo. Here, in the golden light, was everything that mattered. This choice, this reckless, beautiful, terrifying reckoning that felt finally not like falling, but like being safely caught. It was grace. 6 months. A lifetime. The journey to Yorkshire had been a flight into a self-imposed exile, a penance for a joy she felt she had not yet earned. Evangeline had taken the post with the grim determination of a soldier marching into a necessary, joyless battle. She had to prove, if only to herself, that the woman who had unravelled in Adrian's arms was not a creature of weakness, but one of choice. She had to know that her own 2 feet could carry her before she could ever choose to walk beside another. The Cunninghams' house in Yorkshire was a monument to new money and old misery, perpetually smelling of boiled cabbage and damp wool. The 4 children were not malevolent, merely neglected, their boisterous energy a chaotic whirlwind she was meant to tame. Her days were a grey, colourless litany of multiplication tables, corrected posture, and lonely meals eaten on a tray in her small cold room. It was a life of perfect, respectable utility, and every night she would stare out her window at the smoke-stained sky and feel a hollowness so profound it was a physical ache. This was the life she was supposed to want, the security she was raised to covet. It was a cage. After 3 weeks of this silent purgatory, his first letter arrived. The thick cream-coloured paper and the sharp, elegant slant of his handwriting were a shock of colour in her monochrome world. It was not a plea. It was not a declaration of undying passion that would have felt unearned, premature. It was simply a conversation, picked up as if they were still sitting by the fire in the Ravenhall library. Evangeline, it began, without title or formality. The snow has finally melted from the north-facing slopes. I found a patch of early crocuses near the old oak today, a most defiant and startling shade of purple. It made me think of your poetry, the way it finds beauty in things that have to fight to be seen. I hope you are well. I hope you are writing. I encourage you to submit your poetry to a publisher, she wrote back, her own hand trembling, describing the industrial sprawl of Yorkshire, the surprising wit of the youngest Cunningham boy, the way the sunset turned the factory smoke into something almost beautiful. It was a cautious, careful letter, a testing of the waters. His reply was faster this time. He told her of his mother's furious reaction to his refusal to come to London. She has declared me a lost cause, which I find to be a most liberating diagnosis. He wrote of his plans for the estate, not as a lord commanding, but as a man asking for an opinion. I am thinking of opening the library, he wrote. What use are all these words if they are locked away in the dark? I imagine the village children, their hands smudged with dirt, turning these pages. Do you think it a foolish idea? And so, their correspondence became the true foundation of their intimacy. Through ink and paper, across 100 miles, they built something real. They debated philosophy, shared passages from books, and confessed their fears. She told him of her crippling doubt, the voice of her sister in her head telling her she was reaching above her station. He told her of his terror of repeating his father's mistakes, of becoming a man who possessed beautiful things, a house, a wife, but cherished nothing. You're not him, Adrian, she wrote, her pen flying across the page in a moment of fierce clarity. You cherish everything, the flowers, the books, the people. You see the fight in things. That is not your father's legacy. It is yours. It was also during this time, bolstered by his unwavering belief in her that echoed through his letters, that Evangeline took the greatest leap of her own. She submitted her poetry to a publisher in London, and to her profound, earth-shaking astonishment it had been accepted. It was Adrian's letter, arriving just days after she received her own life-altering news, that prompted the offer. A man who cherishes things needs help to care for them. The library project is moving forward. It needs a leader, a guide. It needs a head librarian with a poet's soul and a quiet strength I have seen in no other. The position comes with a salary and the old gardener's cottage by the stream, a place of your own. It is a real position, Evangeline. This is not charity. It is a proposition. Come home. She had resigned the next day, and now she stood in the Ravenhall Conservatory, the morning sun filtering through the vast panes of glass, warming her face. The air was humid and sweet with the scent of damp earth, jasmine, and the delicate perfume of 100 blooming orchids. She ran a hand over the velvety petal of a deep crimson rose, the Evangeline, as Adrian had quietly named the new hybrid he'd been cultivating. It felt like coming up for air after a lifetime underwater. The conservatory door opened with a familiar soft creak, and Adrian entered, carrying a small copper watering can. The transformation in him was even more striking in person. The haunted, guarded Lord of Winter was gone, replaced by a man at ease in his own skin. The weight of his title now sat upon his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle he wore with a quiet, purposeful confidence. He smiled when he saw her, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes and made her heart perform a familiar, joyful leap. "Good morning," he said, his voice the same soft baritone that had filled her dreams for months. He came to stand beside her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. His arm brushed against hers, a simple touch that was no longer the illicit spark of their first acquaintance, but the comforting, grounding contact of a kindred soul. "It is," she agreed, her gaze sweeping over the profusion of life around them, a living testament to his patience and care. "Everything is growing." "It requires patience," he said, his eyes meeting hers, and in their dark depths she saw the entire history of their 6-month correspondence. "And faith, tending to something without any guarantee of a bloom." He was not just talking about the flowers, he was talking about the trust they had placed in each other, the space they had so carefully given one another to grow. He had not rescued her from Yorkshire. He had provided the soil and the sun, and trusted her to find her own way to the light. And she, with her letters of encouragement and unwavering belief, had done the same for him. "I've learned," Evangeline said, her voice full of a certainty that felt as rooted as the ancient vines clinging to the conservatory walls, "that some carriages don't take us away from home, they bring us to it." He set down the watering can, the copper glinting in the sun, and took her hand. His fingers laced through hers, a perfect, seamless fit. It felt natural, inevitable, the quiet, triumphant culmination of a long and difficult journey. "Then let's never stop travelling together," he murmured. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of their reckoning, born of fear and frantic hope. It was not the almost kiss by the fire, heavy with unspoken longing. This kiss was a conversation they had been having for months. It was tender with memory and deep with abiding affection. It tasted of promises kept and a future earned. It was the kiss of two whole people, partners in a collaborative creation, finding their union not in a moment of reckless passion, but in the slow, deliberate and beautiful work of building a life. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "My mother is still appalled," he said, a note of soft laughter in his voice. "But she was quite impressed by the publishing contract. It seems a poet is a far more acceptable partner than a governess." "And my sister," Evangeline countered, a smile playing on her lips, "has decided that being the librarian of a grand estate is, at least, a respectable eccentricity." They laughed together, a quiet shared sound that filled the warm sunlit space. The sun rose higher, streaming through the glass, and in the quiet, green, breathing heart of Ravenhall, a new season had finally, irrevocably and beautifully begun. Love on the Air. The world for Clara Vance began at 4:30 a.m. in the hushed cathedral-like quiet of the WROA studio. It was a space consecrated by routine, scented with the holy trinity of her professional life: the crisp, clean fragrance of freshly printed paper, the faint electric tang of ozone from the broadcast console, and the bitter ghost of yesterday's coffee. Here, in the sanctum of her soundproof booth, she was the master of her universe. Her voice, a smooth and measured alto, was an instrument she played with meticulous care for the listeners of City Sunrise. Her news and culture segment that unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch. Her notes were colour-coded, her timing impeccable. Chaos, in Clara's world, was a myth. In the adjacent studio, chaos was signing off. Leo Croft's laughter tumbled through the thick glass, a warm, unruly sound that always seemed to defy the soundproofing. He was wrapping up the night shift, a freewheeling 3-hour conversation with the city's insomniacs, dreamers, and lonely hearts. Clara could picture him perfectly, leaning into the microphone as if it were a confidant, a stray lock of dark hair falling over his forehead, the worn leather of his jacket smelling faintly of the night air. He treated his callers not as an audience, but as old friends, their shared jokes and easy camaraderie a stark contrast to her own polished formality. The red on-air light above her booth flicked off. Clara allowed herself a small, controlled exhale. Another perfect broadcast. She began methodically organising her scripts into a neat pile when her monitor blinked with a message from Brenda, the station manager. Vance, Croft, my office. Now. Brenda's office was the station's nerve centre, a place where idealism met the harsh reality of spreadsheets. She sat behind a large desk, her expression one of grim pragmatism. "Close the door," she said, without looking up. Clara sat in one of the stiff guest chairs. Leo ambled in a moment later, folding his long frame into the other, with a casual grace that she found inexplicably irritating. "Good morning to you too, Bren," Leo said, his voice still holding the warm gravel of his late-night broadcast. Brenda finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over them both. "I'll cut to it. The quarterly numbers are in and they're not good. We're facing significant budget cuts. As a result, we're consolidating. City Sunrise and the night shift are being eliminated." A cold knot formed in Clara's stomach. She felt the neat stack of her scripts, the product of years of dedication, slide into a chasm. Leo leaned forward. "Whoa, wait. You're cutting both our shows?" "Not exactly," Brenda corrected, a faint, almost predatory glint in her eye. "I'm merging them. Congratulations, you two. Starting Monday, you're the new hosts of the 6 to 10 a.m. drive time slot. We're calling it Morning Rush with Vance and Croft." The silence in the room was absolute. Clara stared at Brenda, then at Leo, whose charming smile had finally vanished. He looked as horrified as she felt. Her, the queen of the prepared statement, and him, the jester of improvisation. It was not a merger, it was a collision. Their first show was, as Clara later recorded in her journal, a delightful disaster. She tried with valiant effort to stick to her segment on a recent city council meeting regarding zoning variances. The proposed ordinance, R22-5, would rezone the waterfront district for mixed-use commercial and residential properties, Clara began, her tone even and informative. From across the console, Leo chuckled. "Hold on, Vance, let's translate. The city wants to let bigwigs build shiny condos where old man Fitz's bait shop has been for 50 years. Let's get a caller on the line. Sal from the south side, you're on the air. What do you think about these mixed-use shenanigans?" Clara's jaw tightened. He was a force of nature, a hurricane in a soundproof room, and she was standing in the centre, holding a script that may as well be a single useless leaf. "While personal anecdotes are valuable," she interjected, her voice tight, "the specifics of the ordinance are crucial for public understanding." Come now, Vance. Leo's voice was a playful prod, a velvet-wrapped barb. Don't you ever feel the urge to throw the schedule to the wind? Tell us what you really think about the city's new parking meters. No notes, just feeling. The tension arced between them, a live wire of genuine annoyance and an undeniable crackling electricity. The hiss of static before a connection was made seemed to echo the space between them. And then the phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree. A woman named Joyce called in, laughing. "I love you too! You sound like my husband and me trying to decide on dinner." Another caller, a gruff-sounding man, said, "This Croft fellow's a menace, but damn if it isn't entertaining. Keep it up." By the end of the show, the station's social media was buzzing. The term hate flirting was trending locally. Brenda was waiting for them when they came out of the studio, a broad, triumphant smile on her face. "That," she declared, "was fantastic. The numbers are through the roof. Whatever that was, that oil and water, fire and ice thing, lean into it. It's gold." Clara looked at Leo, who was running a hand through his already messy hair. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, beneath the horror, she saw something else, a flicker of shared astonishment. They'd created a beautiful, chaotic mess, and the city was listening. The shared space, once a battlefield, slowly transformed. Brenda's decree that they plan the show together forced them into a reluctant armistice. Their battleground shifted from the on-air studio to the cramped production booth and the station's small, perpetually messy kitchen. Late-night planning sessions, which began with heated arguments over segment timing, gradually bled into something else. One evening, hunched over a stack of listener mail, Leo pointed to a letter praising Clara's segment on the Historical Society. "You really love this stuff, don't you? The dusty old facts." "I like stories with clear narratives," Clara replied, her guard firmly into place. "Things that are preserved. There's a comfort in it." She hesitated, then added, "My grandfather owned a used bookstore. I grew up surrounded by them." It was a small offering, a crack in the pristine wall of her persona. Leo didn't mock her. He just nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that," he said quietly. "I learned radio by recording stories on a tape recorder for my little sister. She was sick a lot. I'd make up these wild adventures to make her laugh." He shrugged, a gesture that was surprisingly vulnerable. "Guess I never stopped." In that small exchange, amidst the clutter of coffee cups and discarded notes, the characters of Vance and Croft faded, leaving just Clara and Leo. Their reluctant truce was tested when Brenda sent them on a remote broadcast to the city's annual food festival. It was a miserable, rainy afternoon. They were huddled under a small broadcast tent, the cheerful festival atmosphere dampened by a persistent drizzle. Halfway through their first segment, a gust of wind sent a sheet of rain sideways, shorting out their main mixer. Clara felt a familiar surge of panic. "We have dead air. We have to cut to commercial." "No, wait," Leo said, his eyes bright with a challenge. He pulled out his phone, plugged in a small professional-grade microphone, and hit record. "All right, folks, welcome to the real morning rush. Our equipment has officially surrendered to the great deluge of 25, so we're coming to you guerrilla style." He held the phone between them and pulled Clara closer under the small awning, their shoulders pressing together. "I'm here with the unflappable Clara Vance, who is currently trying not to murder me with her eyes. Clara, describe the scene." Something in his infectious calm disarmed her. "The scene," she said, a small genuine laugh escaping her lips, "is soggy. A man just had his prize-winning pumpkin pie turn into a pumpkin soup. The mayor is hiding under the hot dog stand. Leo bought them a shared cup of hot cider, the cardboard warm against their cold hands. They passed it back and forth, their fingers brushing, huddling together, as they gave a wonderfully authentic, hilarious play-by-play of the dissolving festival. It was their most popular segment yet. The true turning point came a week later. A prominent city councilman, their lead guest, cancelled 5 minutes before he was due on air. Clara felt the world tilt. Her entire second hour was built around him. The colour-coded script in her hand was now useless. She froze, the silence stretching. Then Leo's voice, calm and steady, filled her headphones. "Well, folks, it seems Councilman Davies has had a change of plans, which brings us to a new topic, the best-laid plans gone awry. Call us with your stories of disastrous vacations, ruined weddings, and job interviews gone sideways. We've all been there." He handled the calls with his signature blend of humour and empathy, weaving a brilliant tapestry of shared human folly out of thin air. He had thrown her a lifeline, not with a grand gesture, but with quiet competence. After the show, the studio was silent. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a strange intimacy in its wake. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't quite meet his eyes. "Any time, Vance," Leo replied softly. She finally looked up. He was watching her, his usual playful guard down, his gaze lingering with an intensity that made her breath catch. He reached over to the console and, on a whim, played a song. The soulful, yearning voice of Etta James filled the studio. "At last, my love has come along." Clara said nothing. She just listened, caught in the melody and the weight of his unreadable expression, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with cider and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. Success became a gilded cage. As the ratings for Morning Rush soared, the station entered its crucial spring rating season. The pressure from management, personified by an increasingly manic Brenda, was immense. The studio, once their accidental sanctuary, began to feel like a stage. "The listeners love the chemistry," Brenda announced one morning, waving a sheaf of printouts. "We need to up the ante, more personal stuff. I'm thinking an on-air date. We'll have listeners vote on where you go." Clara felt a wave of nausea. "Our private lives are not a programming gimmick, Brenda." "Leo, talk to her," Brenda pleaded. Leo leaned back in his chair, his easy charm now a thin, brittle shield. "You want chemistry?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or do you want us to sell tickets to our private lives? Because they are not the same thing." The line, once blurry, was now being erased entirely. For Clara, who craved control, the erosion of her private self was terrifying. For Leo, who used his charm to keep the world at arm's length, the monetization of his genuine, emerging feelings felt like a profound violation. The change was palpable. Their on-air banter, once electric with friction and wit, became a careful performance. They were actors playing themselves, and the strain was beginning to show. The breaking point came during a segment on regrets. The topic was Leo's idea, an attempt to steer back toward the authentic connection they had found. Clara, feeling a strange surge of recklessness, decided to participate. "I think, my biggest regret," she began, her voice softer than usual, "is missing an opportunity because I was too afraid to be spontaneous, to deviate from the plan. I was so convinced that my way was the only way that I didn't realise what I was letting slip through my fingers until it was long gone." She wasn't talking about a job or a trip. She was talking about him, about the wall she'd built, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever said on a microphone. The phone lines glowed with callers sharing their own vulnerable stories. For a moment it felt real again, but Leo, stung by the constant pressure to perform and mistaking her confession for just another part of the act, missed it completely. After the show, as she was gathering her things, he walked past her desk. "Great performance today, Vance," he said, his voice cool and detached. "Brenda will be thrilled." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She had shown him a piece of her soul and he had called it a performance. He saw her as a character. Perhaps that's all she was. The carefully constructed bridge between them crumbled to dust. She retreated behind her professional wall, higher and colder than ever before. For the next few days, their on-air exchanges were brittle, sharp, and genuinely frigid. The silences between their barbs were heavy with unspoken anger. One afternoon, Leo put on the Etta James song, perhaps as a peace offering. As the first notes of At Last filled the studio, Clara reached over and, with a sharp, deliberate movement, switched to a traffic report. The listeners noticed. "What happened to Vance and Croft?" one tweet read. "They sound like they're getting a divorce." In the studio, the red on-air light, once a symbol of connection, now felt like an accusation, illuminating the vast, silent chasm that had opened between them. The storm broke over the city just after 9 p.m, a furious assault of wind and rain that lashed against the windows of the deserted WROA station. Inside, the only light came from the green glow of the audio console, casting long shadows across the studio where Clara was packing her bag. She was done. She would work from home, email her segments, do whatever it took to avoid the suffocating tension of sharing a room with Leo Croft. She was just zipping her briefcase when the studio door creaked open. It was Leo, his jacket dark with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked tired, stripped of his usual bravado. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Home," she said crisply, not looking at him. "I've arranged it with Brenda. It's more efficient this way." "Clara, stop!" She froze. He rarely used her first name. He walked closer, the scent of rain and damp wool filling the small space. The storm outside raged, a fitting soundtrack for the tempest that had been brewing between them for days. "I'm sorry," he said, and those words sounded as if they'd been pulled from somewhere deep inside him. What I said after the regrets segment, it was cruel, and it wasn't true. He paused, searching for the right words. "What you said about being afraid, I heard you. I heard the real you. I was just too much of a coward to admit it because it scared the hell out of me." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "All of this," he gestured around the studio, started to feel like they were stealing something that was just ours, and I panicked. I pushed you away because it was easier than admitting how much it meant to me." As he spoke, a small unnoticed light on a secondary panel flickered from red to green. A power surge from the storm had triggered a glitch in the station's emergency broadcast system, silently patching the audio from their studio directly onto the airwaves. They were live, their private reckoning broadcast to every radio in the storm-swept city. But they, in their isolated world, had no idea. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. "You thought I was performing," she whispered, the hurt still fresh. "You thought the one real thing I shared was fake." "No," he said, stepping closer still. The cool surface of the broadcast console was cold under her trembling fingers. "I knew it was real. That's what terrified me, because I'm afraid all the time, Clara. This whole personality," he gestured to himself, "this charming, chaotic guy. It's a script, one I've been improvising my whole life. And you are starting to see past it. And I am falling in love with you, Clara. The real you, not the one on the script." The confession hung in the air between them, more electric than any storm. She looked up at him, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and all the walls she had ever built turned to dust. She closed the small distance between them. He cupped her jaw, his hand surprisingly warm against her cool skin. His kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. Hers was the answer. It deepened slowly, a language of its own, conveying all the arguments, all the longing, all the unspoken truths from the past weeks. It was a kiss of overwhelming relief, of profound recognition. Finally, you see me. Finally, I am seen. His other hand moved to the small of her back, pulling her close, not with force, but with a reverence that made a shudder run through her entire body. Their bodies pressed together, a fragile, explosive connection through their clothes, a dance of deep need and deeper tenderness. Every sigh, every soft sound seemed to carry a lifetime of waiting. In that moment, the entire city, huddled by their radios, heard the soft, unmistakable sounds of their first kiss. Then, just as his lips moved from her mouth to the sensitive skin of her neck, a frantic producer in the master control room, alerted by a flood of stunned calls, slammed a button. The broadcast was cut, plunging thousands of listeners into shocking, absolute silence. But inside the studio, the storm had finally broken. They pulled apart slightly, breathless, resting their foreheads together in the quiet aftermath. The green glow of the audio levels, which had captured the frantic rhythm of their heartbeats, settled back into a calm, steady line. They were off the air, but for the first time they were truly connected. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright. The city washed clean. The atmosphere inside WROA, however, was anything but calm. The broadcast was the only thing anyone was talking about. Clara and Leo walked into Brenda's office side by side, a silent, united front. Brenda looked up from a blizzard of paperwork, her expression a strange cocktail of fury, awe, and sheer, unadulterated glee. "Do you have any idea," she began, her voice low, "what you two have done?" She slammed a stack of ratings projections onto the desk. "You have created the single biggest radio event in this city's history. The advertisers are in a frenzy. The network is calling. Everyone wants to know what happens next." She leaned forward, her eyes pinning them both. "I should fire you for violating about 17 FCC regulations, but the numbers, my God, the numbers," she sighed, a sound of profound surrender. "So here's the choice. We can end the show, issue a public apology, and go our separate ways. Or you can continue. No more gimmicks, no more manufactured drama, just you on your own terms." The next morning at 6 a.m, a city held its breath. The red on-air light flicked on. For a long moment there was only the soft hum of the console. Then Leo's voice, stripped of all artifice, warm and sincere. "Good morning," he began. "For a while now you've been listening to a story. Some of it was planned, some of it wasn't. We've been Vance and Croft, a performance that got a little too real. What we'd like to do from now on is just talk." He looked across the console at Clara. She offered him a small, radiant smile and leaned into her microphone. She held no script. Her hands were resting calm on the table. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice rich with a warmth no one had ever heard from her on air before. "And this is Leo. It's a beautiful morning. Let's see what the day brings." Their banter was different now. It was gentle, teasing, and deeply intimate. They still disagreed about films, about the best way to make coffee, about a new piece of public art. But the arguments were laced with affection, the easy rhythm of two people who were learning the music of each other's souls. The listeners didn't just accept the change, they embraced it. They had been fans of the drama, but they fell in love with the truth. Weeks later, the morning sun streamed into an apartment filled with the scent of coffee and old books. It was Clara's space, a sanctuary of soft light and towering shelves that Leo was only now getting to know. He was in her small kitchen, humming softly as he poured 2 mugs of coffee, completely at home. She came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. The comfortable silence between them was a new kind of language, one that required no words. He turned in her embrace, his hands coming up to cup her face. "Good morning," he murmured, and kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss of comfort and promise, a conversation that had started in a storm and now continued in the quiet light of day. It spoke of shared futures and lazy Sunday mornings, of arguments resolved and vulnerabilities cherished. He lifted her easily into his arms, and she laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. He carried her from the kitchen into her bedroom, the sunlight following them. He laid her gently on the bed, and for a moment just looked at her, his eyes full of a tenderness that made her heart ache with happiness. As his hands began to trace the lines of her body, it was not with the frantic hunger of a first touch, but with the slow, reverent attention of a scholar memorizing a beloved, sacred text. It was a quiet, spiritual act of union, a final confirmation that the love their listeners had only heard was now the solid, breathing foundation of their lives. And so, in the quiet hum of a city waking up, they found their true frequency, not in the sound waves sent out to thousands, but in the gentle whisper shared between two hearts, finally, perfectly in tune. The Katahdin Promise. The rain had been a constant companion for 3 days, a merciless drumming beat against the hood of Alara's jacket. It wasn't the gentle, life-giving rain of poems, but a cold, aggressive torrent that turned the world to a monochrome blur of grey sky and brown mud. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since she'd stood on Springer Mountain, full of a desperate manufactured hope that to the weight of miles of wilderness could somehow rearrange the scattered pieces of her life. Almost a year ago she'd been in a cap and gown, the fabric itching against her neck, a fixed smile plastered on her face as relatives asked the same suffocating question. So, what's the plan? The plan. As if life were a blueprint you were handed with your diploma. Her friends had plans, consulting jobs, grad school, internships that blossomed into careers. Alara had a degree in literature and a hollow feeling in her chest. So she'd concocted an escape she'd framed as a plan, a through hike of the Appalachian Trail. It sounded brave, adventurous. It sounded like anything other than what it was, running away. She thought the trail would provide answers, that the rhythm of walking would pound clarity into her bones. Instead, it had only amplified the silence inside her, a vast emptiness that echoed the endless green tunnel of trees. A slick root, disguised by a layer of decaying leaves, caught her boot, sending her crashing down. Her knee slammed into a rock, and the impact sent a sickening jolt up her leg. She didn't even cry out. She just lay there, face half pressed into the mud, as the cold seeped through her waterproof layers, which had long ago surrendered. Every muscle already screaming from the relentless climbs and descents of the southern Appalachians now throbbed with a fresh wave of agony. "What am I even doing out here?" she whispered, the words swallowed by the storm. Her own voice sounded foreign, thin. "Everyone else has a 5-year plan. I don't even have a 5-minute plan, just mud. And this cold that goes all the way to your bones. Maybe I'm just not built for this. Maybe I'm not built for anything." Tears finally came, hot and pointless against her rain-chilled skin. She pushed herself up, her movements slow and heavy, and leaned her back against the rough bark of an oak. The sucking sound of her boots pulling free from the mud was a sound of defeat. This wasn't a journey of self-discovery. It was a slow, painful surrender to the elements. With trembling, numb fingers, she fumbled inside her pack for her satellite messenger. She'd programmed a message before she left. "I'm done, come get me." It was for emergencies, but this felt like one, an emergency of the soul. Her thumb hovered over the send button. The thought of the subsequent phone calls, the mixture of relief and disappointment in her parents' voices, the quiet "I told you so" from her friends. It was a humiliation she could barely stomach. But the alternative, another day, another week of the misery, felt impossible. Her eyes fell to the trail guide tucked into the mesh pocket of her pack. The pages were swollen and warped from the damp, the ink slightly blurred. She pulled it out, her movements clumsy. Her finger traced the red line of the trail, past her current miserable position. Standing Bear Farm, the text read. A legendary hostel, a sanctuary. She'd read about it in the shelter legs, notes from hikers ahead of her praising its warmth, its ramshackle charm, its almost mythical status as a place to heal. It was just a few more miles. A deal. She made a deal with the part of herself that hadn't completely given up. She would get to Standing Bear Farm. She would get warm. She would have one last night in the strange transient community of the trail, and then, in the morning, she would quit. With that fragile pact, she pushed herself away from the tree, ignoring the protest of her bruised knee, and took one more squelching step north. Elara stumbled into Standing Bear Farm like a refugee seeking asylum. It wasn't a picturesque lodge, it was a chaotic, beautiful jumble of weathered wood buildings, prayer flags, and smiling bearded faces that all seemed to understand the exact kind of hell she'd just walked through. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and something wonderfully, unbelievably like hope. Someone pointed her toward an open bunk in the main hostel, and she dropped her heavy soaked pack with a thud that felt final. The shower was a miracle. For 20 minutes she stood under the stream of hot water, letting it wash away not just the grime of the trail, but the layers of despair that had clung to her like a second skin. She watched the mud swirl down the drain, a symbolic release of the Tennessee drownout. When she finally emerged, skin pink and pruned, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Dressed in her last set of clean, dry clothes, a pair of soft leggings and a worn-out t-shirt, she felt almost human again. Dusk was settling, and a communal fire was crackling in a large stone pit outside. Drawn by a sound that cut through the murmur of hiker chatter, she walked toward it. It was the sound of an acoustic guitar, its notes rich and clear in the cool evening air, accompanied by a voice that was pure, soulful folk. It was a sound of melancholic beauty, a ballad of lost paths and hard-won resilience. She saw him then, and the world tilted slightly on its axis. He was leaning against a porch post, bathed in the fire's golden glow, eyes closed as he sang. He had a strong jawline softened by a few days of stubble, and dark, wavy hair that fell across his forehead. But it was the raw, unguarded emotion in his voice that captured her, holding her motionless on a nearby bench. The song's lyrics spoke of a fastball that had lost its fear, of walking a new baseline, of trading a manicured field for a wild, untamed path. It felt like he was singing her own story, a story she didn't even have the words for yet. He strummed the final resonant chord, letting it hang in the air for a perfect, still moment. Then his eyes opened, and they found hers across the dancing flames. It wasn't a glance, it was a collision. The chatter of the other hikers, the crackle of the fire, the chirping of the crickets, it all faded into a muted hum. In his dark, intense eyes, she saw a flicker of the same weariness, the same searching that she felt in her own soul. For a second, she wasn't a quitter covered in mud. She was just seen. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, reaching his eyes. He shifted, his posture relaxing as the spell broke. The sounds of the evening rushed back in. "Hey, pretty little lady," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that was even better up close. "What's your name?" The question was so simple, yet her mind went completely blank. It was the kind of eye contact that makes you forget your own name. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Elara," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze still holding hers. "Liam? Glad you made it, Elara." He said her name as if it were a song he was just learning to play, and in that moment, huddled in the warmth of a stranger's music and an even stranger's smile, Elara's carefully constructed plan to quit began to unravel. The next morning, Elara found Liam nursing a cup of coffee by the cold fire pit. The air was crisp, washed clean by the storm. Her plan had been to ask for a shuttle into the nearest town. Instead, she heard herself asking, "Which way are you headed?" "North," he said, a simple answer that felt like an invitation. Always north. They decided to hike together for a day. That day bled into a week, and soon the idea of hiking without him felt as foreign as the life she'd left behind. They fell into a rhythm, his long athletic strides pushing her thoughtful pace forcing him to notice the small wonders of the trail he'd been rushing past. Virginia unfolded before them, a seemingly endless stretch of green that had earned the name the Virginia Blues from countless hikers before them. But for Ilara, it was anything but blue. It was the landscape of their beginning. The miles were filled with stories. He taught her how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to listen for the rustle of a black bear in the undergrowth. She taught him the names of the wildflowers that dotted the trailside: trillium, lady slipper, bloodroot. The trail became their confessional. Under the vast, starry skies at trail shelters, their voices low murmurs in the quiet of the woods, they unwrapped their pasts for each other. Liam spoke of the crushing pressure of being a top baseball prospect, the boy with the $1 million arm. He described the sharp, tearing pain in his shoulder that ended it all, and the deeper pain of losing the only identity he'd ever known. "The scout said I had $1 million arm," he said one night, his voice laced with old grief. "Turns out it only takes one bad throw to make it worthless." "Maybe its worth isn't about throwing a ball," Ilara replied softly, her fingers tracing the constellations above them. "Maybe it's about being strong enough to hold a guitar, or my hand when I'm about to slip." She in turn spoke of her own quiet fears, the suffocating weight of an unwritten future, the feeling of being an imposter among her high-achieving peers. With Liam the words came easily, the shame lifting with each confession. He didn't offer solutions, he just listened, his presence a steady, comforting anchor. One sweltering afternoon they followed the sound of rushing water off trail and discovered a hidden swimming hole, a perfect emerald pool fed by a small waterfall. A mischievous look passed between them, a silent dare. Moments later their clothes were in piles on the sun-warmed rocks, and they were plunging into the shockingly cold water. Their gasps turned to laughter, a pure, unburdened sound that echoed off the rock walls. Under the water, his hand brushed against hers as they treaded water, and the jolt was more electrifying than the cold. In that sun-dappled sanctuary, they were just two people, free from their pasts, alive in the moment. Other hikers began to notice the easy orbit they had around each other. They were no longer just Ilara and Liam. They were a unit. It was a grizzled, older hiker named Pops who gave them their trail names. Liam for his legendary fastball and the easy way he could slide a story into any conversation became Mla. Ilara for her quiet, determined search for direction became Compass's Rose. The names stuck, a new identity forged together on the trail. They were Slider and Compass Rose, a partnership growing closer with every mile, the slow burn of their connection warming them more than any campfire. The White Mountains of New Hampshire were a different beast entirely. The trail, which had been a rugged but manageable path, transformed into a series of near-vertical rock scrambles that demanded hands as well as feet. The climbs were longer, the descents more treacherous, and the weather, they were warned, was a fickle god. They had been hiking above the tree line for an hour, the world a breathtaking panorama of granite and sky when the change came. It started subtly. The brilliant blue sky hazed over, and a cool breeze whispered across the exposed ridge. Within minutes, the whisper became a howl, and dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the western peaks, racing toward them with unnatural speed. The temperature plummeted. Ilara zipped her fleece to her chin, her earlier awe turning to a knot of anxiety in her stomach. "We need to get lower," Liam's voice was calm but urgent, cutting through the rising wind. "Now!" But there was nowhere to go. They were on a narrow spine of rock, a stone walkway in the sky. Then came the first flash of lightning, a jagged tear in the dark clouds, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it felt like the mountain itself was splitting apart. Panic seized Alara. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs freezing in place. Liam's hand found hers, his grip strong and sure. The casual, easygoing hiker was gone, replaced by the focused athlete he used to be. His eyes scanned the terrain, assessing, calculating. "This way!" he yelled over the wind, pulling her along. He led them, half scrambling, half sliding, off the main ridge, toward a jumble of massive boulders. Just as the first icy pellets of hail began to sting their faces, he found it. A deep alcove, a small cave formed by two house-sized rocks leaning against each other. He pushed her inside and followed, their bodies pressed together in the cramped space as the full fury of the storm broke around them. Wind shrieked, thunder crashed, and lightning illuminated their tiny sanctuary in stark, strobing flashes. Shivering, soaked and breathless, they huddled together, sharing body heat. The sheer terror of the last few minutes had stripped away every last pretense, every unspoken word that had lingered between them for months. He wrapped his arms around her, his body a solid, warm shield against the storm's rage. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her cheek. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression raw, his eyes dark with an emotion that made her heart ache. "I wasn't scared of the lightning," he said, his voice husky and low. "I was scared of losing you." His inner thought was a revelation. They say lightning never strikes the same place twice. They're wrong. It struck me the moment I saw her, and it was striking me again right now. Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, his lips were on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, fueled by months of unspoken feelings and the raw adrenaline of their survival. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and fear and a profound, overwhelming relief. She kissed him back with all the certainty she'd been searching for since she'd first set foot on the trail, her hands tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer. In the heart of the storm, sheltered by ancient rock, they finally found their own safe harbour. The final climb to Katahdin began in the pre-dawn darkness, the beams of their headlamps cutting sharp cones of light through the cold, pine-scented air. They moved in a comfortable, practiced silence, a single unit against the immense challenge of Maine's greatest mountain. The trail was less a path than a puzzle of giant granite boulders, requiring them to hoist each other up, their movements a synchronized dance they had perfected over 2,000 miles. They were no longer two lost people searching for a way forward. They were a team, each the other's anchor and guide. As they cleared the tree line, the first hint of dawn painted the eastern horizon in pale shades of lavender and rose. The wind was a sharp, biting force, but they barely noticed, their focus entirely on the summit that loomed above them. When they finally pulled themselves over the last boulder and saw the iconic weathered sign, a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled Alara's knees washed over them. Katahdin. Northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. They had made it. They touched the rough carved wood of the sign together, their fingers intertwining. A few other hikers, huddled against the rocks, cheered for them, their voices thin in the vast emptiness. "Congratulations, Slider and Compass Rose," one shouted, solidifying the identity they had built together. They were the Nobo couple, a small legend in the transient world of the trail. The sun broke free of the horizon, flooding the world below with a spectacular golden light. They stood on the roof of Maine, looking out at an endless sea of mountains and lakes, and then they looked at each other. Liam's eyes were full of a love so deep and certain it took Alara's breath away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small smooth stone worn into the shape of a heart by some ancient river. He pressed it into her palm. "I came out here to figure out what to do without baseball," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Turns out the answer wasn't a what, it was a who. My dream isn't about pitching anymore, Rose, it's about writing songs and seeing where this path leads, as long as you're on it with me. Tears streamed down Alara's face, freezing on her cheeks. She looked from the stone in her hand to the man in front of her, and for the first time in her life, her future felt absolutely clear. She hadn't needed to find a specific career or a perfectly mapped out plan. She'd needed to find her direction, her true north. I came here to get away from the world, she whispered, her voice catching. I ended up finding mine. And as the sun fully illuminated the wild, beautiful world below them, he kissed her. It was a kiss unlike the desperate one in the storm. This one was slow and deep and full of the quiet certainty of a sunrise. It was a kiss that held the memory of every mile, every struggle, and every shared laugh. It was the Katahdin Promise. The Appalachian Trail doesn't give you the answers you think you're looking for. It just gives you the miles, the silence, and the strength to finally ask the right questions. And if you're lucky, it gives you the person you're meant to ask them with for the rest of your life.